Story 1. This happened many years ago, in the late 1980s. I was much younger then and used to hitchhike frequently. I didn't have much money, and I didn't own a car. So hitchhiking was often the only way to get around, especially in areas where buses didn't go. One night, I needed to get to a town about 20 minutes away. It was late, and I had just finished a temporary job. I knew roughly where the town was and decided to hitchhike there. I stood by the side of a busy road, watching the headlights of countless cars passing me by, their drivers not sparing me a second glance. After about 10 minutes, a car finally pulled over. A man was behind the wheel. He rolled down the passenger window and asked where I was heading. After I told him, he nodded and told me to get in. I climbed into what seemed like a typical sedan from that time. We drove off, and at first, everything seemed normal. We exchanged some small talk, though I can't remember exactly what we discussed. It was probably just basic, meaningless chatter. Then, things started to feel off. After about 10 or 15 minutes, he took a turn off the main road. I was sure it was supposed to be a straight route to my destination, so I didn't understand why he would turn. We continued down a dark, narrow road, the kind you wouldn't choose to drive on unless you had to. I felt a twinge of unease and asked him where we were going. He didn't respond, just kept driving, his eyes fixed ahead. We turned onto another deserted road, and I asked again. He simply said, "I need to make a stop first." His voice was calm, almost too calm. I asked where exactly he needed to go, but he remained silent. The atmosphere in the car grew heavy, oppressive, like the air was thick with unspoken intent. As we drove deeper into nowhere, the trees closing in around us, I felt my heart begin to race. The headlights barely pierced the darkness, and there wasn't another soul in sight. When he turned onto a dirt road, I knew something was very wrong. The road was rough and uneven, flanked by dense woods on either side. It felt like we were descending into the middle of nowhere. I asked him again where we were going, my voice trembling slightly. He glanced at me briefly, his expression unreadable, and then said, "You'll see." His words sent a cold chill down my spine. I knew I had to get out. He began to slow down as we approached a long, narrow driveway. It was so dark and overgrown that I couldn't see where it led. There was no house, no lights, nothing but shadows. As he turned onto the driveway, I took my chance. I yanked the door handle, threw the door open, and jumped out of the moving car. I hit the ground hard and rolled into the grass beside the trees. My body ached, but I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline surging through me. I glanced back and saw the car's brake lights flare up as he stopped, gravel crunching beneath the tires. Panic surged inside me. I turned and bolted into the woods, branches whipping against my face and arms as I pushed through the underbrush. I could hear the car revving up behind me, and I didn't dare look back. I ran deeper into the forest, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. I stumbled over roots and rocks, trying to put as much distance between myself and that car as I could. After what felt like an eternity, I paused, hiding behind a thick tree, listening. In the distance, I heard the car moving, its engine a low growl as it prowled the area, searching. I held my breath, heart pounding in my ears, terrified that he would find me. I waited there, shivering in the cold, until the sound of the engine finally faded. Eventually, I made my way back to a road. I don't know how long I walked, but every car that passed sent a spike of fear through me. I was ready to dive back into the woods at any moment. After what seemed like hours, I saw a gas station. It was still open, a beacon of light and safety in the darkness. I went inside and asked the clerk where the nearest town was. He told me it was just a mile up the road and that there was a motel. I thanked him and, with shaky legs, made my way there. I spent the night at the motel, but sleep didn't come easily. I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't jumped out of that car. To this day, I don't know what that man had planned, but I'm grateful I never found out. Story 2. 2 years ago, I was driving home late at night after a long shift at work. The roads were mostly deserted as I left the highway and continued onto the quieter rural roads. I still had about 15 minutes of driving left before reaching my apartment. The road was flanked by dense woods on both sides, casting shadows that seemed to move in the corner of my eye. As I approached a stop sign, I noticed a figure standing on the side of the road. It was a man, carrying a small backpack, and he looked like he was hitchhiking. Something about his presence felt off. It was rare to see hitchhikers in this area, especially so late at night. I felt a shiver run down my spine as he turned his head and looked directly at me, his eyes glinting in the dim light. He raised his hand and waved slowly, as if beckoning me to stop. My heart pounded as I came to a brief halt at the stop sign. For a moment, I considered what to do, but instinct took over, and I pressed down on the gas pedal, speeding through the intersection. I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw the man standing motionless, still staring as my car disappeared down the road. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm my nerves. The road ahead straightened out after a gentle curve, and that's when I saw it. A sea of red brake lights stretching into the distance. A traffic jam in the middle of nowhere. My pulse quickened. What could be causing such a backup at this hour? I slowed down and eventually came to a complete stop behind the line of cars. The minutes ticked by and the traffic didn't budge. I put my car in park, rolled down my windows for some air, and grabbed my phone, trying to find out what was going on. Nothing seemed to explain the situation. All I could see ahead were rows of motionless vehicles and the eerie glow of brake lights. Suddenly, a soft thump broke the silence, coming from my right. I whipped my head around just in time to see a face pressed against my passenger window. His face, the hitchhiker. My breath caught in my throat as he began to climb through the open window, his movements quick and unnaturally fluid. I was paralyzed with shock. Before I could react, he was inside, sitting in my passenger seat, his eyes locked onto mine. "What are you doing?" I stammered, my voice trembling. The man leaned closer, his grin spreading wider than it should have, the dim light catching something dark smeared across his hands. "I really need a ride," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. I told him to get out, but he just shook his head slowly. "Just a few towns over," he murmured, leaning even closer. Panic surged through me. I glanced at my phone, but before I could reach for it, his hand shot out, gripping my arm with surprising strength. "You're not calling anyone," he hissed, his nails digging into my skin. Desperation took over, and I slammed my hand onto the horn, the blaring sound piercing the still night air. The man recoiled, covering his ears, but he didn't let go. I kept pressing the horn, my entire body shaking with fear. "Stop it!" he yelled, his face contorting with anger. I screamed, hoping someone, anyone, would hear me. The commotion caught the attention of the other drivers. Horns began blaring all around us, a chaotic symphony of noise and confusion. For a moment, the man seemed to waver, his eyes darting to the other cars. Then, without warning, he released his grip, flung the door open, and sprinted into the dark woods, his figure swallowed by the shadows. I sat there, gasping for breath, my body trembling uncontrollably. Someone approached my car, their expression a mix of concern and confusion. I managed to tell them what happened, my voice barely more than a whisper. After what felt like an eternity, the traffic began to inch forward. I learned later that a fallen traffic light had caused the jam, but the details hardly mattered. I kept driving, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement, expecting to see him lurking in the darkness. When I finally reached home, I sat in my car for a long time, the events replaying over and over in my mind. I still don't know who that man was or what he truly wanted, but the thought of his cold smile and those dark, hungry eyes still haunts me. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, waiting in the shadows. Story 3. I was driving down a desolate road one late night. The darkness enveloped everything around me, and the road stretched out endlessly with not a single car in sight. The silence was oppressive, and I was eager to get home when suddenly I spotted something up ahead. A woman standing alone on the side of the road. She wasn't near a house or any place that made sense. She just stood there, illuminated by my headlights, looking completely out of place. As I approached, I slowed down, wary. She was standing dangerously close to the lane I was driving in. I watched her carefully as I got closer, and then, to my surprise, she stepped into the road and started waving at me. It wasn't a panicked wave. It was almost casual, as if she was beckoning me to stop. I hesitated, but eventually came to a halt right in front of her. She walked around to my driver's side window and I rolled it down just a crack. There was something unsettling in her eyes as she leaned closer. I asked her if she was all right, and she said she desperately needed a ride. When I questioned why she was out there at that hour, she dismissed it, saying she only needed to go a few miles up the road. Despite the unease creeping up my spine, I agreed to give her a ride. After all, it was on my way. She climbed into the passenger seat, and I asked where exactly she was heading. "Just a few miles up," she repeated, without specifying. A sense of dread settled in, but I pushed it aside and started driving. We traveled in tense silence for a few miles before she suddenly instructed me to turn right. I did as she said, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. The new road was even more isolated, shrouded in darkness, with dense woods lining both sides. Then, out of nowhere, she told me to take a left down a narrow, almost hidden path. The road became rougher, the trees closing in around us, casting eerie shadows that danced in the headlights. My heart was pounding as she ordered me to stop. Confused, I glanced around. There was nothing. No houses, no signs of civilization, just thick woods and an overwhelming sense of foreboding. "I'll get out here," she said, breaking the silence. She thanked me for the ride, but something was off. I asked why she wanted to be dropped off in the middle of nowhere. She only repeated that this was where she needed to get out. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. This wasn't right. She reached for the door handle and then paused, turning to look at me with an unsettling intensity. "Could you get out and help me with something?" she asked, her voice a bit too calm, too insistent. My instinct screamed at me that this was wrong. "With what?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. "Just get out of the car," she said, her tone darkening. My pulse quickened, fear coiling in my stomach. I shook my head, refusing. Her expression twisted, and she suddenly screamed at me, her voice filled with a ferocity that sent chills down my spine. "Get out of the car now!" Panic surged through me. I slammed my foot on the gas and sped off, her screams echoing in my ears. I drove for what felt like forever, my hands trembling on the wheel until I finally pulled over, my heart racing. I turned to her, my voice shaky with anger and fear. "Get out of my car, now!" She glared at me, her eyes wild and menacing, cursing me under her breath. Finally, she opened the door and stepped out, slamming it shut behind her. I didn't wait. I tore down the road, glancing in the rearview mirror, but she had already disappeared into the darkness. I called the police as soon as I felt safe, reporting everything. Whatever her intentions were, I knew I had narrowly escaped something terrible. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if I had gotten out of the car that night. Thanks for joining me on this journey into the night. If you enjoyed the hunt and want to see more adventures, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you want to stay updated on all our midnight mysteries, make sure to subscribe and ring that bell. Your support helps us uncover more secrets and bring you thrilling new content every week. Until next time, stay curious and keep hunting. This is The Midnight Hunt, signing off.